The rain outside hammered against the windows, a backdrop to the tension-filled evening inside the warm but quiet home. Emily wiped her hands on the kitchen towel, her thoughts as scattered as the ingredients she'd left on the counter. Her husband, Roger, had called earlier, informing her that a last-minute business trip would keep him away for a few days. She hadn't felt the sting of his absences for years, not when they had become so routine. Their marriage, once fiery and filled with passion, now trudged along like a dutiful march. Emily sighed and poured herself a glass of wine, letting its dark richness settle the nerves she couldn't quite place. She flipped through her phone absent-mindedly, scrolling past pictures of old vacations, photos of their wedding, and candid shots of her stepson, Ethan. Her chest tightened briefly when she landed on one from last Christmas, a picture where Ethan stood behind her, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. The way his green eyes had lingered on her that night hadn't been motherly. It was a fleeting thought, one she had buried deep until now. Tonight, Ethan was home early. Emily didn't know why that fact unnerved her, but the awareness of his presence upstairs was like a live wire threading through the air. She decided to distract herself, turning on some light jazz as she chopped vegetables for a lonely dinner for one. Ethan watched the rain slide down the window of his bedroom. His mother had died when he was 6, and though Emily had stepped in admirably after marrying his father a decade ago, things between them had always felt complicated. Not in a bad way. More like two puzzle pieces that didn't fit naturally but had been forced together. In the past year, however, Ethan had begun noticing her in ways he hadn't before. The way her laughter would echo in the house when she thought no one was watching. How her lips curled around the edge of a wine glass. It was wrong to think of her that way. He knew it. But that didn't stop his heart from racing every time they crossed paths. He heard the clatter of dishes from downstairs and knew she was cooking. He also knew Roger wasn't around to help. His father's increasingly long absences weren't just felt by Ethan but by Emily too, though she pretended otherwise. Ethan stood, running a hand through his damp hair. The idea of dinner alone with her sent an unfamiliar thrill coursing through him, a feeling that both intrigued and terrified him. Before he could stop himself, he descended the stairs, letting his presence be known with the deliberate creak of each step. Emily heard the stairs before she saw him, her pulse quickening for reasons she didn't dare name. She looked up as Ethan stepped into the kitchen, his presence commanding the room in a way that was unsettling. He wasn't a boy anymore. At 21, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had started noticing his effect on people, especially women. "Need help?" he asked, leaning against the counter, his grin crooked but disarming. Emily smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I wouldn't mind some company." As they moved around the kitchen, an easy rhythm developed. Emily handed him vegetables to chop, and Ethan obliged with skill she didn't know he had. The wine bottle between them emptied slowly, and the conversation grew lighter, freer. They laughed about silly childhood memories and debated the merits of different genres of music. But beneath the surface, something simmered. Emily noticed the way Ethan's gaze lingered on her lips when she laughed, the way his hands occasionally brushed hers, lingering just long enough to make her stomach flutter. She chastised herself for being ridiculous, but the feelings were undeniable. When the food was ready, they settled at the small dining table in the corner of the kitchen. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the windows. The intimacy of the evening pressed in on them, an invisible barrier shrinking until it felt suffocating. "You look beautiful tonight," Ethan said, his voice low, cutting through the ambient sound. Emily froze, her fork hovering midair. The compliment wasn't casual. It carried a weight that pinned her to her seat. "Ethan," she began, her voice unsure. "I'm not a kid anymore, Emily," he said, leaning forward. His tone was measured, his gaze steady, the playfulness gone. "I see you. Really see you." Her heart raced, her breath caught somewhere between fear and something darker, more thrilling. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, forbidden but undeniable. She opened her mouth to respond, to chastise him, to stop whatever this was from spiraling further. But then, the lights flickered, the storm taking its toll on the power. The sudden darkness plunged them into silence, their breaths the only sound in the room. Emily's fingers gripped the edge of the table. She couldn't see him, but she could feel his presence like a magnet, pulling her closer to a moment she wasn't sure she wanted to resist. The power outage left the house cloaked in darkness, but Emily's awareness of Ethan remained sharp and vivid. The storm's howling winds drowned out everything except her shallow breaths. She could hear Ethan shift in his seat, his chair creaking slightly. "Are you okay?" His voice came out softer now, a cautious question cutting through the tension. Emily swallowed hard. "I'm fine. Just startled." The room stayed still for a moment, save for the pounding of rain against the windows. Emily fumbled for her phone on the table, its screen casting a pale glow across her face. She saw Ethan watching her, his features half illuminated, his expression unreadable. "We should check the circuit breaker," she muttered, standing abruptly. The scrape of her chair against the floor seemed unnaturally loud. "I'll do it," Ethan said, rising as well. He was close, closer than she'd realized. His height dwarfed hers, and she could feel the warmth of him even though he wasn't touching her. "No, I'll manage," Emily said quickly, stepping back. She wasn't sure if she was retreating from the physical task or the electricity buzzing between them. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he moved aside, letting her pass. But even as she made her way to the basement, she could feel his gaze following her, a weight she carried down the narrow stairs. The breaker box was old, and the damp basement smelled faintly of mildew. Emily clicked on the flashlight app on her phone and directed the beam toward the panel. Her hands were trembling. Whether from the cold or the tension, she wasn't sure. The storm outside seemed to rumble in tandem with her nerves. She flipped the switches systematically, willing the lights to return, but her mind wasn't on the task. It was upstairs in the kitchen, replaying Ethan's words and the way they'd made her stomach twist. The lights flickered back on, startling her. She exhaled sharply, allowing herself a brief moment to gather her composure. She couldn't let this happen. Not the thoughts creeping into her mind, not the sensations crawling under her skin. It was absurd. He was her stepson. Her stepson. Emily trudged back up the stairs, resolving to act as if nothing had happened. She stepped into the kitchen, its familiar glow restoring some semblance of normalcy. Ethan was still there, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching her. "Fixed it," she said, her voice breezy, her tone forced. "You're good at that," Ethan replied, his words laced with something she couldn't quite name. Admiration? Amusement? Something heavier? Emily busied herself with tidying up, avoiding his gaze. "I guess I've had to get good at a lot of things." "Like pretending?" Her hand froze mid-reach for a plate. The words hung in the air, challenging her. She turned to face him, her cheeks hot despite her effort to stay composed. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, folding her arms defensively. Ethan stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "It means you don't have to pretend with me. I see it, Emily. I see how lonely you are. Dad's not around. He hasn't been for years, not really. And you're just supposed to keep everything together, like it doesn't hurt." Emily's breath hitched. His words pierced through the armor she'd built around herself, exposing truths she wasn't ready to face. This isn't appropriate," she stammered, her voice faltering. Ethan stopped, mere inches away. "You don't have to say anything. Just don't lie. Not to me, and not to yourself." The sincerity in his tone broke something in her. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. Her mind screamed at her to end this, to tell him to stop, to create the distance that should have been there all along. But her body refused to move. "I should go to bed," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't argue. "Good night, Emily," he said, his voice steady but soft. She didn't dare look back as she hurried to her room, closing the door behind her as if it could lock out the feelings swirling inside her. But even as she lay under the covers, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the way he'd looked at her. like she wasn't invisible, like she mattered. The next morning, Emily awoke to sunlight streaming through her curtains, a cruel contrast to the stormy chaos inside her mind. She dragged herself out of bed, trying to shake off the fog of restless sleep. In the kitchen, Ethan was already up, a mug of coffee in hand. He was scrolling through his phone, but he glanced up when she entered. His gaze was unreadable, his expression calm, almost casual. "Morning," he said, as if the night before hadn't happened. "Morning," Emily replied, her voice tentative. For a moment, the silence between them was unbearable. But then Ethan handed her a cup of coffee, and she took it, her fingers brushing his briefly. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly, nearly spilling the coffee in the process. "Thanks," she murmured, retreating to the far end of the counter. They drank in silence, the unspoken tension from the previous night settling like a heavy blanket over the room. Emily wanted to say something, anything, to break it, but what could she say? How could she undo what had been set into motion? "Emily." Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts, startling her. She looked up, and his eyes were on her again, steady and unrelenting. "What?" she asked, her voice defensive. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You don't have to answer this, but are you happy? With him?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Was she happy? The answer had once been clear. But now? She began, but the words caught in her throat. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said, standing. "Just think about it." With that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts, her coffee, and the question that wouldn't stop echoing in her mind. The question Ethan had asked refused to leave Emily's mind, lingering like a phantom throughout her day. Was she happy? She had never thought to ask herself that. Happiness had always seemed like a luxury in a life dominated by responsibility. Her marriage to Roger, though steady, had long since lost its spark. It had become a partnership of convenience rather than a union of passion. By mid-afternoon, Emily had exhausted herself with chores, hoping the physical effort would quiet the thoughts clamoring for her attention. But it was impossible to shake the lingering memory of Ethan's gaze or the undeniable pull she felt when he was near. She hated herself for it. She was his stepmother, for God's sake. How could she even entertain such thoughts? But no matter how hard she tried to suppress it, that forbidden thrill of being truly seen persisted. Ethan spent the day out, retreating to a coffee shop in town to escape the tension at home. But no matter how far he went, he couldn't escape her. Emily's presence was like a shadow, following him, her laughter, her scent, the way she bit her lip when deep in thought. He had crossed a line last night, and he knew it. He'd seen the conflict in her eyes, the way she had wrestled with herself. But he'd also seen something else, something that told him she felt it too. That scared him as much as it excited him. By the time he returned home, the sun was beginning to set, painting the house in warm, golden hues. He didn't expect to find Emily in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book, her bare feet tucked under her. She looked up when he entered, her eyes wide with surprise. "Oh," she said, sitting up straighter. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon." "I didn't think you'd still be here," Ethan replied, his tone light but probing. "Where else would I be?" she asked, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was such an ordinary exchange, but it was charged with the weight of everything unsaid. Ethan walked toward the couch, sitting down at the opposite end. He was careful not to get too close, but the proximity was enough to set Emily's nerves alight. "What are you reading?" he asked, gesturing to the book in her hands. Emily held it up, the cover revealing a romantic novel. Her cheeks flushed slightly. "It's just something light. Is it any good?" Ethan leaned back, his arm resting along the back of the couch, dangerously close to her shoulder. "It's escapism," Emily admitted, closing the book. "Sometimes you just need to get lost in someone else's story." Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "And what about your story? Is it the one you want to be living?" Her heart skipped a beat. "Ethan, you can't just answer the question," he interrupted gently, his voice soft but firm. "Are you happy, Emily?" The air between them grew heavy, charged with unspoken truths. Emily set the book down, her hands trembling slightly. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I care," Ethan said simply. "And because I think you deserve to be." Her resolve wavered. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it?" Ethan asked, leaning closer. "Or are we just taught to believe it is?" Emily turned to face him, their faces inches apart now. Her breath hitched as she looked into his eyes, the intensity in them undoing her. "You're my stepson," she said, more to herself than to him. "And you're the only person who's ever made me feel this way," Ethan replied, his voice trembling with honesty. The moment stretched, each heartbeat echoing like a drumbeat in Emily's ears. She knew she should stand, walk away, put an end to whatever this was before it could go further. But her body refused to move, rooted to the spot by the magnetic pull between them. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to stop him. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a jolt through her. Emily gasped softly but didn't pull away. Instead, she let him take her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Emily," he said, her name a plea on his lips. "Tell me to stop." She opened her mouth, ready to do just that. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat frozen, caught between the weight of her guilt and the intoxicating freedom of surrender. I don't know what I'm doing," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. "You're living," Ethan said, his voice filled with an urgency that mirrored her own inner turmoil. "For once, you're living." Before she could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in the faintest of touches. It was tentative, hesitant, a question rather than an act. Emily's breath caught, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. And then she kissed him back. The kiss was electric, igniting something in Emily that had been dormant for far too long. Her hands found their way to his chest, her fingers clutching at his shirt as if anchoring herself to reality. Ethan deepened the kiss, his hands cradling her face, their passion growing with every second. It was raw. It was forbidden. It was everything Emily had been missing. But then, as quickly as it had started, she pulled away, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. "We can't," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and regret. Ethan looked at her, his expression filled with both longing and understanding. "I know." Emily stood, running a hand through her disheveled hair. This can't happen again." Ethan nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed his true feelings. "I'll respect whatever you decide, Emily. But don't pretend this didn't mean something. Not to me, and not to you." She turned and fled the room, her heart racing as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. Once inside, she leaned against the door, her body trembling. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between falling and retreating. But one thing was certain. There was no going back to the way things were. Emily barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, the memory of Ethan's lips against hers consumed her. Her mind waged war against her heart, each thought louder than the last. She told herself it was a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment, but deep down, she knew better. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way he saw her, the way he made her feel alive. By morning, her resolve had solidified. She would confront him. She would lay boundaries, firm and clear, and ensure they never crossed that line again. This had to stop before it spiraled further out of control. When she stepped into the kitchen, Ethan was already there, a mug of coffee in hand. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers with the same intensity as the night before. Emily's stomach twisted. She opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan beat her to it. "Morning," he said, his tone careful, almost gentle. "Morning," she replied, her voice more clipped than she intended. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "I didn't," she admitted, setting her hands on the counter to steady herself. "Ethan, we need to talk." He nodded, setting his mug down. "I know." Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself. What happened last night, it can't happen again. It was a mistake, and we need to move past it. Ethan leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed. Was it a mistake? He asked, his tone calm but probing. Or are you just scared of what it means? Emily bristled. It doesn't mean anything. It can't. You're my stepson, Ethan. This is wrong on so many levels. Is it wrong to want to feel something real? He asked, his voice soft but unyielding. Because that's what it was, Emily. It was real. She shook her head, a mix of frustration and despair bubbling to the surface. You don't understand. This isn't just about us. There are consequences. Consequences for what? Ethan interrupted, his voice rising slightly. For two people who care about each other, who make each other feel alive. Why is that so terrible? Emily's chest tightened. Because it is. Because it's not supposed to happen. I'm married to your father. Your marriage is a sham. Ethan shot back, his tone sharper now. You know it. I know it. He's never here, Emily. He's never been here. And you're not happy. You haven't been for years. His words struck a chord, but Emily refused to let them sway her. That doesn't make this right. Ethan took a step closer, his voice softening. It doesn't make it wrong either. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their emotions filling the space between them. Emily's mind screamed at her to walk away, to end the conversation and put as much distance between them as possible. But her body betrayed her, rooted to the spot. I need to go, she finally said, grabbing her purse. I need some air. Ethan didn't stop her, but his gaze followed her out the door, burning into her back like a brand. Emily drove aimlessly, the city streets a blur as she tried to clear her mind. She ended up at a park, parking her car and walking until her legs ached. She found a bench beneath a tree and sat, burying her face in her hands. How had things gotten so complicated? She'd always prided herself on her self-control, her ability to keep her emotions in check. But Ethan had shattered that control with a single kiss, exposing the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. As she sat there, her phone buzzed in her purse. She hesitated before pulling it out, half expecting it to be Ethan. But it was Roger. She stared at the screen, her heart sinking. She hadn't heard from him in days, and now, the sight of his name filled her with guilt. She answered reluctantly. Hi, she said, her voice subdued. Emily, Roger said, his tone brisk. I just wanted to let you know I'll be home tomorrow night. The meetings ran longer than expected. Okay, she said, her throat tightening. Everything okay there? He asked, though his tone lacked real concern. Everything's fine, she lied. Just busy. Good, Roger said. I'll see you tomorrow then. The call ended abruptly, leaving Emily feeling hollow. She stared at her phone, the weight of her marriage pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. She knew Roger's return wouldn't change anything. It never did. When Emily returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the house. She stepped inside, bracing herself for whatever awaited her. But the house was quiet, almost eerily so. Ethan, she called, her voice echoing faintly. There was no response. She checked the living room, the kitchen, even his bedroom, but he wasn't there. A pang of worry settled in her chest. She checked her phone for any missed messages, but there was nothing. She was about to call him when the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside, his hair damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. Where were you? Emily asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Out, he said simply, slipping off his shoes. Emily crossed her arms, her frustration mounting. You could have told me. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady. Why? So you could tell me again how wrong this is? How we're not supposed to feel this way? Emily flinched, his words cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Ethan, please, no, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. I'm not going to apologize for how I feel, Emily, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. But if you want me to stop, I will. You just have to tell me. She stared at him, her heart pounding. His words were both a challenge and a lifeline, offering her the chance to take control. But the truth was, She didn't know what she wanted. She only knew that every moment with Ethan felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, thrilling and terrifying all at once. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ethan nodded, his expression pained but understanding. "Okay." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the hallway. But even as he disappeared from view, Emily felt the pull of him, a magnetic force she couldn't resist. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The next day dawned with a deceptively calm sky, but Emily woke with a storm inside her chest. Roger was coming home tonight, and the thought filled her with dread instead of relief. For years, his absences had been a balm, a space where she could exist without the expectations of being a wife in a marriage that had long since grown cold. But now, his return threatened to dismantle the fragile balance she had struck with Ethan and with herself. She avoided Ethan all morning, occupying herself with errands and tasks around the house. When she passed him in the hallway, he didn't speak, but his gaze lingered, heavy and questioning. She didn't know how to face him, not after everything they had said and done. By afternoon, the tension had become unbearable. Emily found herself retreating to the garden, hoping the fresh air might clear her head. She knelt by the flower beds, pulling at weeds with a ferocity that matched the chaos inside her. She didn't hear Ethan approach until his shadow fell over her. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but insistent. She didn't look up. "What is it, Ethan?" He crouched beside her, his presence unsettlingly close. "We can't keep avoiding each other." "I'm not avoiding you," she lied, yanking another weed from the soil. "Yes, you are," he said, his tone calm but unrelenting. "And I get it. This is complicated. It's messy, but it's not going to just go away because we ignore it." Emily sat back on her heels, finally meeting his gaze. "What do you want from me, Ethan? Do you want me to admit that I feel something for you? Fine, I do. But it doesn't matter. It can't matter." "It matters to me," Ethan said, his voice trembling with emotion. "You matter to me." His words undid her. She felt tears welling in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "This is wrong. You know it is." Ethan reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. "If it's so wrong, why does it feel like the most honest thing in my life?" Emily's breath caught. She wanted to pull away, to put an end to the conversation, but instead, she found herself leaning closer. The world seemed to shrink around them, the garden fading into a blur of colors and sounds. All she could see, all she could feel, was him. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her turmoil. "I don't know how to stop." Ethan's fingers brushed against hers, a delicate touch that sent shivers up her spine. "Then don't." Before she could respond, the sound of a car door slamming shattered the moment. Emily's heart lurched as she realized what it meant. Roger was home. She scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt from her hands and jeans. I need to go," she stammered, rushing toward the house. Ethan didn't follow, but she felt his eyes on her as she disappeared inside. Dinner that evening was a strained affair. Roger sat at the head of the table, regaling Emily and Ethan with tales of his business trip. He was oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between the two, the stolen glances, the silences that stretched a beat too long. Emily forced herself to smile, to nod at the appropriate moments, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time Ethan spoke, her pulse quickened, her body hyper-aware of his presence. She could feel the weight of his gaze even when she wasn't looking at him. After dinner, Roger poured himself a drink and settled in front of the TV, leaving Emily and Ethan to clean up. The kitchen felt too small, too charged as they moved around each other in near silence. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said finally, breaking the tension. Emily shot him a sharp look. "What do you expect me to say?" Ethan leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. "I don't expect anything, but I can't pretend this doesn't exist." "Keep your voice down," she hissed, glancing toward the living room. "Why?" Ethan challenged, his voice low but firm. "He's not paying attention. He never does. That's the whole problem, isn't it?" Emily's jaw tightened. This isn't about him, isn't it? Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He doesn't see you, Emily. He hasn't for years. But I do. I see you. Her resolve wavered. Ethan, please. I can't do this. You already are, he said, his tone soft but insistent. You're just too scared to admit it. Emily turned away, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. This has to stop. Ethan sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and longing. If that's what you really want, I'll stop. But you have to tell me, Emily. Look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same. She couldn't. The words refused to come. Yeah, Ethan said after a moment, his voice tinged with sadness. That's what I thought. He left the kitchen, and Emily sank against the counter, her legs trembling. She stayed there for what felt like hours, the sound of the TV droning in the background, until she finally gathered the strength to face Roger. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside her husband, Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of her own making. Roger's steady breathing beside her was a cruel reminder of the life she had chosen, the life she was supposed to want. But all she could think about was Ethan. She heard the faint creak of floorboards in the hallway and knew it was him. The house was dark and quiet, but the tension was palpable. She closed her eyes, willing herself to stay in bed, to let the moment pass. But when she opened her eyes again, she was already out of bed, her feet carrying her toward the door. The hallway was dimly lit, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Emily hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob to Ethan's room. She knew she shouldn't, knew this would only make things worse. But then the door opened and Ethan stood there, his expression a mixture of surprise and longing. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. Emily stepped inside, and the door closed softly behind her.